All right, we have a sign-in sheet that is coming around, and if you'll take a copy of the tips that are also included in that, it'll help you in teaching this topic to your class. I see some familiar faces, so some of you have already heard us speak before. My office, as you all know, is located in Martindale, and Lindsay's in Leicester. We wanted to just talk to you about a few things. I think I'm going to let Lindsay get started on the key issues that we'll go
Sure.
over.
So the reason that we really push teaching this in EDHE is because first year students are actually most at risk of experience all the things we're going to talk about today, especially sexual assault. I know from the number of my clients, the overall client population at the counseling center, first year students are number one by a lot. So we want them to know about our policies and our resources more than any other group on our campus because they're the most likely to utilize the resources. They're more vulnerable because they aren't as familiar with alcohol and drugs in particular. And we make them do some lovely online training before they get to campus. And before they get to campus, they think that they understand these issues. They think they understand what sexual assault is. They think that they would intervene in these situations. But then when we ask them the same questions after they've been here on campus, their attitudes changed for the worse. So they now think there's a lot more gray to the issue. So we want to reinforce the important messages for them once they're here. And regardless of when we ask them, students always think that they would intervene and do something to protect someone else, but they don't think other people would. So talking about this in your EDHE class helps reinforce for them that other people care and that we all care about each other on this campus and that we're all going to do what we can to keep each other safe. I already mentioned Campus Clarity is our online mandated training for all incoming students. They have to complete it by the first day of class or they'll have a hold placed on their account. They also have to complete it before recruitment if they want to go through recruitment. So most students do complete it before the first day of class. And they hear from us at orientation for about 20 minutes. So it's not really effective for them just to have those two pieces of education. When we talk about prevention, you need multiple doses. You need to hear the same message over and over again for it to be effective. So an EDHE class is the perfect time and opportunity for them to hear that message.
So basically, when we're talking about Title IX, we want you to talk to your students not just about the Title IX policies, maybe just give an overview of what Title IX is. And basically, it's only 37 words. Most of the guidance that we've gotten actually comes from the Office of Civil Rights and a Dear Colleague letter. Title IX, when I was a young girl, I understood it to be equality in women's sports. Now it's expanded to so much more than that. Almost every university has to have a Title IX coordinator. This university, I'm the primary contact, so if you get a complaint, let your students know where to report. This is one of the number one questions we get from our office is, well, if something happens to me or one of my friends, where do I go? Well, they can come see me. As I said, my office is in Martindale. They can call me, they can email me. Lindsay's office, they can go there. She's actually confidential unless it's an ongoing threat to campus safety. They can go to the counseling center as a confidential resource. So let your students know where they can report. Also, another important thing for you to let your students know is that you are a mandatory reporter. If they report anything to you directly, you have to report it to my office. It's important to let your students know that because you may have conversations, particularly if you're covering this kind of material, you may get a disclosure. So let them know that you have to report it to my office, and you also need to let them know about those offices if they don't want to discuss those issues with you, where they can go and not have those reported.
And Honey already covered most of this. But the real key is if you have to report something to Honey, some of you may have done this and know this, it doesn't mean that an investigation automatically opens. The student still has some power and control over what happens next, so they can go and talk to Honey. They can say, leave me alone if they want to be left alone. There are limited circumstances when an investigation goes forward when a student doesn't want them to, but that's never happened when Honey was here, and when our previous Title IX coordinator Joseph was here, it happened twice. So this is not something that happens commonly. Usually the student gets to make the decision whether or not the incident gets investigated. And just because you have to report something doesn't mean you won't support a student if they come to you. If you're an EDHE instructor, you care about students. This isn't something most people are mandated to do. So it's okay. We actually have lots of disclosures to EDHE instructors because they do feel more comfortable with you than they feel with their other faculty members. And if you are talking about this in your class, I always just say, kind of give students permission to get up and leave if they need to, go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, and make sure that they have the counseling center's information. This is another big thing when you're talking about this issue. It's always more effective, the research shows, if you talk about why it's important to you first. So your students understand, hey, this is an issue that I care about too. This isn't just an issue that affects all of you. I'm not talking at you. We're having a conversation about why we all care about this issue. For some people, they talk about my boss at the counseling center, Bud, always likes to make a joke that he got into doing this work so he could end sexual assault before his daughter went to college, and he failed. But that's why he cares. He cares because he wants to prevent these things from happening. And it's really important for your students to hear that from you too, because then they'll buy in more when you start talking about the issue.
So we recommend, first of all, that you go through our policies. Our policies are pretty accessible. Do we have one of those slides on here for it? I'll show you what they are, but if you need a copy of our policy, you can always look it up on our website, umsafe.olemiss.edu. I think Lindsay's going to go over that. Is a great reference for any of our questions, any questions your students may have, any questions you might have. It reminds and centers students on what we're trying to prevent too. If you talk about the policies, unfortunately, sometimes the sexual misconduct policy and knowing these things and knowing the repercussions for them is the only way to get through to students, particularly when they're first coming to school. They're going to be really focused on our two-strike policy. They're going to be really focused on, that's why we also talk to them about our amnesty policy, that if something happens while they're out drinking, if somebody's using drugs, they're not going to get in trouble for that if they're trying to get help for one of their friends. And these are conversations we want you to have in the classroom. Another thing that we try to emphasize to them is the difference in what they understand consent to be. I always tell them, that I was a prosecutor before I came here, and the criminal definition of consent is much different from our consent policy here at the university. It's got to be an affirmative agreement through clear actions or words to engage in intimate activity. You can probably have an entire class just on this, because then when you talk about a person who's incapacitated, unconscious, unaware, or otherwise physically helpless, that they can't give consent. You don't even, so if you have this second part, you don't ever get to the first part. I probably had more discussions with students based on that, asking about what constitutes, how do I determine that? What about if the respondent's been drinking? I mean, there's lots of conversations that you can have, and Lindsay and I'll come to your classroom or have those conversations with you before if you want us to, but it's a really great way for students to understand what that consent policy means and to compare it to maybe their state's criminal statutes. Here in Mississippi, the age of consent is 16. Unless you're in a position of trust or authority, and then it's 18. And that's really all that we say about consent, in Mississippi. This is really, really different for most of our students. And I mean, Lindsay can probably tell you, there's a great video. It's in, I think, was it the second or third page? It's Who Are You? Who Are You? Mm-hmm. And we show that video, and it looks more like a typical night out partying. It's somebody who's incapacitated, and I think you've actually, Ross has said that's pretty similar to some events that our students might face. Great way to start these conversations. Here's our sexual misconduct policy. A lot of people are pretty shocked to see vandalism included. If it's sexual in nature or motivated by sex, where I've seen it is where young people write, excuse my language, slut or whore on somebody's car, and then that triggers a Title IX investigation. Voyeurism, we've had these cases engaging in secret observation or non-consensual recording for personal pleasure. This one is a big one, sharing of explicit pictures or videos without consent. I mean, we're in this age of technology. We see this where people are in relationships, they break up, one decides to share it on a GroupMe, and obviously that's in violation of our policy. We don't see many sexual exploitation or indecent exposure, but what's gotten the most attention is going to be your sexual touching and your sexual penetration. Stalking is also included, and it doesn't have to be of a sexual nature. It just has to be a course of conduct directed toward a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And this does include cyber stalking, because like I always tell the students, when I was in college, somebody had to actually physically come to stalk me, right? They had to sit outside my house. Now they can find people through Twitter, Facebook. They take pictures of their food, ping themselves at restaurants. We've had people change their profiles to try to get in touch with people, make up profiles so that they can stalk one another. And it gets to be really scary for these individuals. Sexual harassment is another one. It has to be objectively offensive, pervasive, or severe, and deny them access. So if they're trying to go to class every day and somebody's making sexual comments to the point that they want to avoid going to class, you have then gotten into the realm of sexual harassment. You know, again, each of these could be topics you talk about all together or separately. Relationship violence is also something that our students tell us they don't think of when they hear Title IX. We see lots of these, and with stalking and relationship violence, we're about 50-50 male-female. So it's not gender specific. The males usually ask me for no contact letters. And in those situations, it's usually, it's pretty serious. And the relationship violence cases, I would say, are the most frustrating for us, because you've got to be really careful. They don't want to get out of those relationships. They don't want to see somebody punished. There also can be the ones that can get the most violent. So that's a great conversation to have in class. We have interim measures. We want our students to know if something happens to them, we're here. We make academic accommodations. Lindsay will talk about some others. Amnesty, I talked about this briefly. The freshman classes are usually the most afraid of the two-strike policy. We have had freshmen riding around with one another with someone sexually assaulted in the back seat, more concerned about somebody getting a strike than getting them medical attention. Please, please, please emphasize this. This is going to pertain to respondents, complainants, and any potential witnesses. So if they need to get help for somebody, let them know nobody's getting a strike. If we see somebody's name 4, 5, 6 times, they may have to undergo drug and alcohol education, because we're worried about them at that point, but it won't go in their conduct record. And we want to encourage our students to come forward. And that's why we also have this policy, our retaliation policy. We have in the past had students that tried to intimidate other students from coming forward or for participating in one of our investigations. If anybody takes any adverse action, and that's pretty vague, and tries to interfere with our investigation, they could be charged with a separate violation, which would be this retaliation charge. So, for example, a young man finds out his best friend has been accused of sexual assault. He then decides he's going to reach out to the alleged victim and tells her to back off, or he's going to make sure she doesn't get into a sorority. Well, his best friend's found not responsible for sexual misconduct after an investigation. The young man who reached out, the best friend, is still on the hook for retaliation, and our precedent has been that they are suspended for at least a year from this university. So, you know, it doesn't help your students at all. We want them to understand that we take this very seriously because we want everyone to feel comfortable participating and moving forward. And I always tell them, you may not even be helping your friend if you're interfering in the investigation. We can't get all the facts. So, this is a recap. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay so it's not just me talking the whole time. I receive reports from faculty, staff, students, UPD. We have this new Live Safe app. Y'all know anything about that? Okay, so students can actually directly talk to me if they want to. Sometimes we get walk-ins. If the student decides that they want an investigation, I'll talk to the complainant, their witnesses, the respondent, their witnesses. I'll get medical reports, text messages, you name it, I'll take them. The student is going to make that decision unless there's that ongoing threat to campus safety. We have a hearing. It says prompt, fair, and impartial because we have trained faculty, staff, and students. From the day the student tells me they want a report till the day that there are sanctions issued, we have 60 days. And I can tell you from working with in the criminal context, that's a minimum of 18 months. So it's a much faster process. Our sanctions are going to be based upon the violation. If it's sexual assault, the Office of Civil Rights has told us we have to either suspend or expel that student if they're found responsible because we have to keep this campus community safe. And I'll let Lindsay talk to you about her office.
And I'm just going to do a quick overview of my office and then talk more about activities and classroom things that you can do. So my office, I work directly with people who experience all the violations that Honey just covered. So if a student's experienced any of those things, they're eligible for services from me. I also work a lot with parents. However, I can only talk to parents with students' permission. 99% of my cases, I get permission to talk to parents because when these things happen, parents want questions answered all times of the day and night, pretty much constantly, so they'd rather have mom or dad bugging me rather than them, and I'm happy to do that. I also work a lot with friends, people who are just concerned, they're not sure what to say or do. They can come and have a conversation with me, and my office is responsible for prevention as well. It's just me in my office and a GA, so I'll just make that note for later when we say we can come to your class. Just schedule early if you want me to come. What my office does really depends on the situation. So the number one thing I do is academic accommodations. On that note, I may actually be reaching out to you as EDHE instructors. If your student's impacted by one of these issues, they may miss your class, and attendance is very, very important for EDHE in particular. It's something we really hammer into them. Don't miss EDHE. It's an easy class, so just go. So because of that, they're usually stressed about missing EDHE if they do miss the class. So you may actually get an email from me asking you to excuse your student. I would please encourage you to excuse your student if I email you. I'll ask if they missed anything in particular, so if there's makeup work or anything else I need to know, please let me know. I'll let you know that email. I'm not going to tell you what happened to the student. We also ask you not to go to them and ask them what's going on. If they want to volunteer that information, they'll come to you. If they don't, they won't. So just give them space, treat them like normal if they're not going to come and talk to you about what's going on. Housing accommodations. I actually have keys to something called safe rooms throughout the year, so I even have them with me today. We have rooms that are set aside in student housing for both men and women for emergency situations. So usually I use these in domestic violence situations or relationship violence. Sometimes in stalking situations, if it's a crisis and we need to move them immediately, we use those rooms. I'm the only person who knows who's staying there, so it's a really safe situation for them. We can also work with our lovely housing partners who will move students for Honey or I pretty much immediately. Emily Stiles there is great, so it makes it really easy if that's what a student needs. No contact letters are something that we can get issued usually the same day through the conduct office. I can also go with students to our justice court if they need a protection order and help them through that process. If a student does decide to go through an investigation with Honey's office and through the student conduct process, I can help them through that process. I can also help them if they report to the police. UPD and OPD allow me to be present for interviews, so a student doesn't have to be there by themselves. They also call me. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My busiest time for on-call is the fall semester, so I'll just warn you about that. If I'm supposed to come to your class, I'll do my best to reschedule immediately if I get called out. So I go to the hospital usually on the weekends, so it doesn't tend to impact my day-to-day work, but it's a really important part of my job, so students know that they have that support all the time. We even work with parking. We actually really like Mike Harris. He's a great guy. So if a student's really stressed out about their parking situation, usually this comes into play in stalking situations in particular. We've had situations where people's cars are getting damaged over and over again, and parking is really great about getting them special parking. We cannot do that for ourselves though, So when we talk about consent, Honey mentioned, it's sometimes easier to talk about consent when we don't talk about it in terms of sex. Sometimes it's more comfortable for instructors as well. This isn't everyone's most favorite topic to teach on, and I understand that. The tea video is really great. I think most people have probably seen it by now. It uses a cup of tea to talk about consent. There's another video. If you don't like that video, I can send you that uses a cell phone. We also have these lovely cartoons that I like to use when I talk about consent because it's more of a conversation. So we just wanted to throw out some different options for you because consent's a really, really important topic to cover in your class. So bystander intervention, when we talking about bystander intervention, we will still be doing the It's On Us campaign this fall. We're trying to work with athletics around a partnership game, not football, but one of the other sports. That'll be later in the fall semester. We'll have our big It's On Us week of action. The message we really send to them is step up, don't stand by. For those of you who've been around a while, we used to use Green Dot. However, when we did evaluations of Green Dot, students really didn't like it. So we stopped using Green Dot because if it's not effective, we're not gonna do it. Students like that message a lot more. But this is the best way for us to try to prevent these things from happening on our campus. And when we talk about intervention, we always start the conversation around the 3 Ds, direct, distract, and delegate. Direct, students always assume it's really confrontational. It's not. It's just starting a conversation, going up to the people that you're concerned about, even just saying hello to figure out what's going on. Distract. This is what our students love to do and love to think about doing. Distracting is really easy to do with drunk people. So it's really, really easy for them to come up with those ideas because drunk people are really distracted by almost anything. And it's okay to have that conversation with them because the reality is they'll be in these situations. Not all of them will be, but most of them will be. And then delegate. You know, we have the shy students or the people who think, I'm not going to do these things, but asking someone else for help is still doing something. And we want to normalize for them that that's okay, that you don't have to be the person to do it if you can find somebody else to do something. So this is probably the most important message around intervention that we want you to stress to students. This video is the video that Honey and I use if you've ever had us come to your class. So this year, because there's so many classes and it's hard for us to come to a lot of them, we actually created a guide to using this video in your class that cues up the exact times in the video to use, the questions to ask your class, all of that, because this is a really, really great tool. Students love this, so I highly recommend if you're going to teach this topic to use this video. The big cautions, it is from New Zealand, but it's really, the only thing that comes up is flatmate is roommate, but you can still understand everybody in the video. But this video is truly probably the best tool that we have around bystander intervention that we've found to be the most effective in our conversations. So we highly recommend that. Utilizing groups, if you're going to use the video or not use the video, we really encourage using groups and not a full classroom to have some of these conversations because it allows students, one, to get to know each other better, to feel more comfortable sharing, because not every student in your class is going to be the one who wants to volunteer their information in front of everybody. So we really encourage you to think about, breaking them up into the groups. The video makes it easy because there are 4 people you talk about in the video, so you can have 4 groups. There's another resource in your packet that has written scenarios, so you can break up students into groups for those scenarios. I taught this class for a few years, and the first class I taught, they actually acted out the scenarios because they were very active and participatory class. Not every class is like that. My second class was not like that. But if you have a class where you think that might work, students really enjoy that. Rasa really likes doing stuff like that. So I always like to give a plug for that too. So another thing we encourage you to talk about around bystander intervention are the obstacles to intervening, because it's not always easy to intervene in situations. This is another tool that's in your packet. There are instructions for all of them. So we ask them to think about bystander dynamics, if that's something that's more of a psychological concepts that influence the fact that lots of people don't intervene. So some people like more the academic side, so that's a way to include that. To think about groups that influence their behavior, that's a good conversation, particularly around the time of recruitment, when people start to really get in different groups and really be influenced by those groups. One tool that I've used with my students in the past is writing about what is the biggest obstacle for them. And when I have that conversation, I talk to them about my biggest obstacle as well, is that I'm actually a really shy person, and I don't like intervening with people I don't know. It makes me really, really uncomfortable. And so I talk about that because I want them to understand it's not easy for everybody, but that there are always things that we can do. So again, the more vulnerability you have with your students, the more they're going to buy into this conversation. Resources, Honey already talked a little bit about this. Safe is really the #1 resource. It's the most updated resource, although we have a few updates we need to make. I promise it'll be updated by the first day of class. It has all of our contact information. Student health is a wonderful resource for students in these situations. They actually have specially trained nurses called SANE nurses who can do evidence collection and are really informed. Hospital, less so. It's not to say they don't have nurses and 24/7 coverage, but it's just not the same experience as students have at Student Health, unfortunately. The counseling center is free, in case you didn't know. I hope everyone knew that. But we also have walk-in hours. So students can walk in the fall between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., and they can get seen by a counselor that day. So, students actually don't like picking up and calling people on the phone anymore. So the walk-in system has really helped us because people just like to show up and don't like to call. My office is in the counseling center, so students can feel free to walk over. It's always best to contact me first, though, since there's one of me. Our conflict resolution office is the office that deals with all the conduct side. Family crisis is an off-campus option that some students feel more comfortable with, so I always like to mention them as well. The last activity this is my favorite activity to do because I used to do domestic violence work, but it's around domestic violence, relationship violence, and learning more and talking more about what that means and what that looks like. It's again in your little guide, but students rank behaviors on a continuum, and we have a discussion about what they think are the most harmful and least harmful behaviors. One that tends to really start debate is harming animals, because we always have our really passionate animal people who think it's the worst thing that can happen to someone, but it's actually a really common behavior in abusive relationships. So having that conversation has really opened students' eyes to these things. When I do this activity, we actually see an increase in reports afterwards, or I've noticed, because people don't really realize what relationship violence is. We've seen a stark increase in the relationship violence reports we got this spring. So we're hopeful that students are recognizing that it is more of an issue. So this is an activity I would encourage you to use. But I understand you have a lot to cover in your class. So bystander intervention is really the most important thing. But I also really love this activity, so I always like to mention it. We also want to talk about things that might happen in your classroom when you talk about these issues. The number one thing that happens is students will disclose that it's already happened to them because, again, we get information from them before they come to school here, and depending on the year, we have at least 15% of our incoming students who've already been sexually assaulted before they ever set foot on our campus. So that's a big percentage of our incoming class and a lot of people who might disclose something. I'm not going to say it's definitely going to happen in your class, but when you talk about this issue, it's more likely that someone's going to say, this happened to me. And when that happens, usually more people start to say, this happened to me too. So it can be difficult to manage in your classroom. Always just thank them for sharing that information. We don't expect you to be counselors. We don't expect you to know exactly what to do. Just say thank you, that you believe them, you appreciate them sharing that information, and check in with them after class instead of derailing the whole class and making sure that they're okay. You do have to report those disclosures, but it doesn't mean they have to do anything. And in a lot of those cases, there's not much we can do if something happened to them before they came to school here, but in some of those cases, there are actually a lot of things we can do. We've had cases where, we've had people who might come to school here the next year, and there are things that Honey can do about that. So you may think it's pointless to report something if it happened to them before they came to school here. No, actually, there may be opportunities for us to do something in those cases. Some other things that commonly happen, victim blaming statements. If you use the video that we recommend using, the young woman gets really, really drunk in it. She has, I think, about 14 or 15 drinks in the video. So people always comment on that. There's always the one student who says, well, she drank too much. So she kind of knew this might happen to her. And that's an important point. You could get into a debate with that student, and I'm sure you'd all be really great. But getting into the debate takes the whole class away from what you're talking about. So, my encouraging point on that is always to say, thanks for sharing that, but what could somebody else have done when they saw that she was having 14 drinks? They could have made sure that she got a safe ride home. They could have gotten her some water, gotten her some food. So really focus on the fact that there were other people around when she was drinking. Other people saw this was happening too, and we all need to look out for each other because we don't know why she was drinking 14 drinks. People drink for lots of different reasons, sometimes to cope with things. Sometimes they just have those unhealthy behaviors, alcoholism, unfortunately. So we really want to focus back on that bystander. Sometimes people laugh when we show videos, particularly around the incident itself. That's uncomfortable. They get uncomfortable when you talk about this in class sometimes, and that's why it's okay. It's okay that you're laughing, but this is something that really happens to people too. That's why we're talking about this. This isn't just something that happens on a video. The other thing that can happen when you talk about bystander intervention is people say, well, I'll just get violent. I'll punch the guy. We really don't want to encourage violence. That's not the goal. I'll always tell them, if you feel like you need to do something violent, that's when it's time to involve law enforcement. The people who are trained to intervene in those situations, and more, that violence can actually make everyone less safe. If you go up and punch somebody, then more people could start getting violent, and they could face, criminal charges, student conduct charges. Just because you say you're intervening and trying to be a good bystander does not absolve you from that. So if you heard us today and you really don't want to talk about this in your class, that's okay. My office, Honey, Ross's peer educators can come to your class if you'd like. Like I mentioned, the sooner the better. My September, unfortunately, is already getting pretty full. If you just want a PowerPoint or more resources, we're happy to help with that too, because we want to make it as easy for you to teach this as possible, because we really want you to cover it. I think in our notes we say we really encourage covering this topic before October 9th, because what people call the red zone, or the most dangerous time for first year students, is the first 6 to 8 weeks on campus. So we always say earlier the better if you're going to cover the subject. If students are really excited about this, we want them to get involved, especially first-year students. I love having first-year students in RASA. They're very active on social media during the school year. We're also going to have a lot of events this year that you can send your students to so they can write papers about it or whatever else they need to do. The house party, which we had a few years ago, which Derek started, give him a shout out since he's in the room. But our mock house party we're going to do again this year. It looks like tentatively September 14th. Don't quote me on that yet. But it's a really fun educational event, but also they get fed, and so they can win prizes. We are not doing Sex Week this year. We're just doing something called Sextravaganza. It's for 3 days in September, so there'll be some fun events. Ross is going to do their consent carnival that Tuesday, September 12th. So that's another fun event where they play all kinds of consent games. And like I said, it's on this week of action. It'll be in November. So for those procrastinating students, there'll be lots of events that you can send them to later in the semester. So we went through that really fast. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask this for a while now. The blue light poles and the LiveSafe app. The LiveSafe app is relatively new, like this past year, right? So I guess there might not be a whole lot to say about it or not, but how effective are those two things for students?
The blue light poles, a few of them are out of order right now because of the construction on campus. They're still there, but they don't work. I would say blue light poles are more there to make people feel safer than actually do much, because most of the time when people hit them, they're drunk and walking by and no one's there. I would say, it's hard if you're really not feeling safe. You hit the button and you have to yell into them what's going on. So most of the time, if you're running from something, you need to keep running. That's why we really encourage LiveSafe over the blue lights, because LiveSafe, you can initiate a conversation with UPD on your cell phone. If you need to run or go somewhere, they know your location, so they can send someone to you even if you're a moving target. So I really prefer pushing LiveSafe because LiveSafe also has features like the Safe Walk feature, where students can share their location with a friend if they're going to walk across campus by themselves, and then the friend can see them as they walk across campus. Go Safe, yeah, it's Go Safe and then Safe Walk on the app. So I really think it's just more effective, because students always have their cell phones on them, and the blue lights are, I think we have 19 on campus.
I don't think that blue lights have been used for the purpose. Honestly, in particular, the people that I've talked to said that when they're at places, there's, they don't want to push a button, like she said, and yell into it and stand there and wait. It's a lot more effective to have it on their phone. Those geolocators on the LiveSafe app, I would encourage your students to download them, because, it's not just good for sexual assault, because they can text with law enforcement and they can text back and forth. So it's great that way. Also for active shooters. Like, they'll talk to them about that. But if there's an active shooter on campus, you'll know where they are. That app is just, we've seen it. It's fantastic. So my preference would be not to have the blue lights at all, and only put all our resources into the LiveSafe app right now.
So when I was an undergraduate, my fraternity raised money to try, or is still raising money to put a blue light pole on Frat Road.
Right.
I don't think anyone will ever hit that. But it's, again, I think blue lights are more about the sense of safety, and a reminder that the police are there. That's why they're on almost every college campus.
Yeah, I don't know what studies about the effectiveness is, but.
I encountered my very first, more so unruly student about, as we did bystander intervention, with the "it's not my problem," and I'm not a cock block and all that kind of stuff, even with other students chiming in and trying to get him to change his mind. There was just no budging. If you have any suggestions for cases like that, or?
I mean, it's hard because the research on this actually tells us, 80% of people buy in and 20% never will. And so sounds like one of your students was one of that lovely 20% who's just not going to buy in. I think trying to minimize as much as you can the influence of that person, kind of try to redirect the conversation away from them, move on to something else. I think utilizing your other students to have the conversation with the student is more helpful too, because then it's a debate between the students. It's not just a debate between you. The worst case that I've dealt with and what they tell us when we get trained on how to facilitate these trainings is you can always ask somebody to leave if they're going to be that disruptive in your classroom and say, we're trying to learn about this, and if you're not going to be respectful of the fact that everyone else wants to learn about it, you can step out for the day too. Again, not something I would prefer to do. Depends on the level of unruliness you're dealing with. But I think, again, if somebody's not going to buy in, you may not be able to get through to them. Yeah.
One thing that I've done, and I think I've learned this from you in training, is to approach it in a way of, what if this was your little sister? What if this was one of your friends who is a girl? Wouldn't you want someone to interfere and do something? Did you try that? That was my only idea.
Yeah.
That usually does it, but if that's not going to do it, I think you got to move on. I'm sorry.
Are you saying live safe, like LIVE?
Live Safe, yes. It's a free app that you all can actually download as well. You can use it just like students can. If you have an Ole Miss ID and password, you can join the Ole Miss network. And it's actually really nice. It's another thing that sends you all the tornado warnings and stuff too. So you definitely know. Yeah, you definitely know if anything's happening on campus. But it's really convenient for those times when you want to tell the police something, but you don't want to call them, which students actually say happens to them a lot.
Do you have a question?
Would you comment for the group here, of course, journals are a key component in this class, building relationships with students and getting to know them. You get a journal submission from a student who has been sexually assaulted. What does that do in terms of reporting?
You have to report it.
We've had some confusion over the years on that because people feel, some instructors have felt, well, it's kind of like,
It limits their
white
academic,
privilege
no.
that communicating
Right.
privately and sharing this, not thinking you're going to share it with anybody else.
And
Right,
this is part of the reason why we encourage you to use, I think the template syllabus has Title IX language in it as well, and covering that with your students so they know. It's a harder conversation to have when this has come up. Often the instructor will call me to say, I read this, what do I do? And we're happy to have that conversation before you approach the student. But yes, you will have to report it. But students haven't been that upset after the report has been made, I think because they realize, they don't have to go and talk to Honey. They don't have to do anything about it if they don't want to.
And and you're right, because I've had some professors say, well, they told me this in confidence. Well, none of you are I'm not trained as a counselor. Our roles on campus are to teach and train, mine's investigate, but, that's why we let them know. I think at the outset, if you let them know, these are your confidential resources, that way you don't get yourself in that position to begin with.
You referenced the packet of information. Did it go around? Okay.
I don't know where it stopped, but yeah.
We can
We can send you a copy.
we can send electronic copies so then everybody can get it.
Do you mind going over the confidential resources? I know counseling center.
Yeah. Psychological Services Center in Kennard Hall. COPE, which is in Insight Park. Student Health Services. In 99.9% of cases, I'll be confidential for students. I go over what that means when we start our conversation. And those are, I believe, all the on-campus resources that are confidential. Oh, and Josie Nicholson, who works in athletics.
Yeah, if they're an athlete, they don't know who that is. And you guys can call us anytime if you have questions throughout the year, or if you need some guidance on syllabus language. We're around. All right, where did the sign-in sheet get off to?
It's over here.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, thank you all so much for having us.